So good morning. I'm just going to switch on recording, and we're going to go on with this particular unit. So what I've done is, as we discussed today, I've just picked up a unit which is going to start a bit of, start the course with a bit of a, interest in terms of, one of the exciting areas, which is events management in the tourism and hospitality sector. We tend to refer to this sector as something called the THM, Tourism, Hospitality and Management, because at level 4 and level 5, when you're looking at studying the qualification, I think what the qualifications offer would be that you will learn a lot of variety of things which are associated in terms of events, activities, and the key deliverables of this sector. So at some stage, you will study things like destination management. You'll also study, marketing, a bit of HR, a bit of finance. And the idea would be to try and make you aware of how these functions are very specifically, useful when you run this as a business or when you work within this particular industry or the sector. Now, before I start, it is worthwhile mentioning that, this sector is the largest employer in terms of people in the world. And this within the services sector. So, and also generates revenues in excess of, I think, $2.6 trillion. So by far one of the biggest industries and sectors in the world. It has lots of ancillary industries which work along with the tourism, travel and hospitality sector. And if I look at just the statistics on UK in terms of, the industry and turnover and stuff, just to give some numbers, I think last year, if I look at the data as per the UK travel and tourism body, this particular sector contributed about £46 billion in terms of, sales and turnover to the UK economy in general. If you look at some of the things like which is the most visited or, the most popular tourist or, tourist destination or vacation, country in the world, up until last year, it used to be the United States. And I think they held that for about 10 years or so, or roughly around that time frame. And now it has been overtaken, Spain this year. So roughly about 80 million, customers or, holidays actually visit Spain every year. And that's why it's the most popular destination when you look at, some part of this industry being set up in that part of the world. So in general, quite exciting because it includes things like airlines, hotels, resorts. You also look at events, you look at meeting, conferences, exhibits. They're all a part of this particular sector. Now, because this sector has become so big over the years and it provides so many diverse opportunities for, people to work within the sector, some of these sectors are kind of, branched off as individual, let's say business units, as we use a term called SBU, strategic business unit. So we will refer to this THM as a sector, but within this sector, you have lots of different types of industries which have come up, and events management is one such area, which itself, if I have to put it this way, it's a stellar area in terms of, generating revenues, quick revenues, or, bringing in cash flows wherever they are held. Whether it's a music concert, whether it's a football event, whether it's Olympics, these are all big events, and they bring in cash flow to any economy, any country, any city, and they are an integral all policy making with pretty much every government, whether you look at it at the national, regional, or international level.
Yes,
there are lots of bodies associated with this sector. And in the UK, if you come across, I think we will go through some of the slides, and this will be across the course. There are bodies like ATHE, all protected. You get to hear these terms. And we set up, in order to protect both the employer and also the employees working within this sector. So at some stage when we are on the receiving end, when the flight is delayed or our holidays get cancelled, how do you get insurance? How do you get compensation? On the other side, if you are looking at staying in a location and you don't follow the rules, or maybe in some cases you have kind of breached the contract, so how do the hoteliers or the place that you've stayed actually end up recovering the cost? So lots of bodies which have come up over the years, which kind of work with the government and in general the bureaucrats to create policy and legislation which basically protects both the, let's put it this way, customers and also the providers in this sector.
Okay.
What we want to do is start off with this unit, which is events management. It's quite exciting in the sense that I think at some stage in our, obviously working lives, we've always participated in events or been a part of a team wherein you can hold small events or contribute to events or, kind of operationalize, implement some of the projects, small projects as events. And I think we'll get to see and familiarize ourselves with some of the, terms and terminology within this particular unit. Now, as I explained briefly earlier, I think the grading structure across the qualification remains the same. So you'll have an achieved or a not yet achieved, which is pass or a fail. We don't call it pass or fail. We call it achieved or A, and not yet achieved is NYA. So the structure of the unit will involve you looking at doing an assignment or a report, and that will cover, the tasks given across in the 4 learning outcomes. So this morning, what we are looking at doing is basically starting off with learning outcome 1. And in this, go through a few slides just to cover this off in terms of an overview. And then I'll probably send you 1 or 2 small handouts to kind of, this learning outcome in a bit more detail so that you're able to crystallize on some of the, theoretical parts which are required to understand and build some foundation in this unit. So, any questions, just feel free to ask me. And I think there's loads of material that we have on this particular unit in any case. So just feel free to ask me questions. And if you're struggling and if you need more reading material, let us know. We've got a lot of books available, which obviously, if not there, I'll have a check at the, the VLE. And if it's not there, then at least for this unit, there is a book which is there, which is from the recommended list. So let's briefly starting off, we look at what are events. There are loads of types of events that we have. Sometimes you have a birthday occasion or, you have a wedding anniversary, and these are also classified as events. So obviously, from our point of view, what we want to be able to do is look at the definition of, event management from a perspective of, the travel and tourism or, this particular industry in general. Now, when we look at, defining events, there are different types that we can look at. So they could be classified into, private events, religious events. You look at, sometimes it's music concerts and festivals. You have sporting events like the Olympic, or we have the FIFA World Cup, which is happening currently right now. And this is a big event happening across Russia and multiple cities. And then you have corporate events, and, you have sometimes community or cultural events, which have the flavor of personal and, obviously participation from the mass public. But what is event management in general? Event management, if you have to define, how would you define event management?
If I had to define it, I guess it's really just going through the process of trying to organise from the beginning to the events, really. Just, Yeah, that's correct. So I think a good start in terms of, just the initial thoughts would be that, something which basically is planned and coordinated, because events in general will involve a lot of people. If you're going to do something which is going to be done personally as a team of 2 or 3 people, it might not be classed as an event, it might be classed as an activity. So when we look at doing things, we kind of planned and also coordinated. But at a smaller scale, we will tend to call them activities or group activities. But the moment the scale becomes big, and that involves a lot of people, or a lot of people who will benefit or participate in that activity, then that term we will class it as something called an event. And if I add management, what we are looking at doing is we are basically managing the whole process of the coordination and the planning to be able to deliver something wherein people can participate and do a meaningful participation in terms of contribution. And that process for that particular, event or phenomena will actually be classed as something called events management. The reason, if we start looking at, practically, if you imagine an event in terms of what happens. So if I look at, say, for example, a music concert that I've been to, the first thing that I look at is you have to do bookings. The second thing is you arrive at the venue, you get some sort of a stamp on your wrist or, on your fist, or you have a
got a tag which goes around your wrist. It is to show that, okay, you bought the ticket and you've been allowed in. When you go in, you think of a lot of, stalls and, bars or things like that, wherein you can have a few drinks, and then you get into a big kind of a arena or a podium wherein you are then listening to, or, facing towards a particular side in order to kind of, enjoy that particular function. So if I have to turn that and relate it to the definition, what we are saying is that the event would involve, when I say planning, so planning is the travel, the planning is the ticket, planning is the booking, the planning is going through the security check. And when we look at other things in terms of participation, what we're looking at doing is when you are at the event, what you tend to do is you tend to engage in a number of, or a series of activities. So you might grab a drink, meet some friends, participate, enjoy, and those kind of things. Even say, for example, parking, events management, when you have large gigs and concerts, what you will see is that there are queues of parking, and, they try and sort out all these things to ensure that you have a smooth transition from where you arrive, park your car, and then go into the arena or the venue. So all these, if you visualize, are nothing but a part and parcel of, event or event management.
Yeah.
And as I've given a brief example, when we look at large events could be like the FIFA World Cup, which is happening across, which is happening in Russia, but across a number of cities. And there is a huge amount of participation by, people in terms of stadiums, infrastructure, obviously people participating, and those then are classified as, large sporting events. So in general, what we get to see is that, yes, with an event, it seems quite simple, but if you look at the event and itself, within the event and event management, you have loads of other activities which are happening, which can create business opportunities or business for, various different smaller other entities within this, and become a part and parcel of the event management as a function. So parking, for example, could be one such big area, and if you have gigs happening all across in that stadium throughout the year, then what you get to see, parking becomes a regular phenomenon wherein it's a business opportunity or a business interest, and that without being there, you will have a chaos in terms of, or not have proper infrastructure in terms of, people coming in and arriving through road or by transport and not being able to park. So that itself then presents, an opportunity. Now, let's look at understanding why do we need events. The next question is, okay, this particular sector, the THM sector, is quite big, quite diverse. It has loads of industries in it. So when I think of airlines, when I think of cruises, for example, when I think of corporate events, or, even if events like golf, sometimes you see a lot of companies, they organize a golf event, and they invite top executives, and, it's primarily held in a particular resort wherein it is famous for either a golfing or, as a destination. But why do you think, people still require these events? So there is a simple answer to this question, is that why do hotels, a lot of these large businesses, hold events? So if you see, and I give you again a practical example, is if I see just Manchester. Now Manchester has obviously two large, football teams which are very popular in the world, like the City and the United. Now, during the whole season, the stadias, in which the matches happen are pretty much booked, fully packed, but there is this need for additional cash flow or additional money to flow in when the Premier League is off and there are no matches happening during the summer, because the players are engaged in either UEFA League or European matches, or like the FIFA World Cup. There are no matches happening as of now in the stadium. But because the infrastructure is huge and it requires ongoing investment for maintenance and, loads of other things in terms of, in the business, sometimes you will see the organizers or the owners of such large infrastructure, they depend on events to create a spike in revenue. So their idea of not having the cash flow kind of altered or, having a stop to it, what they look at is certain short bursts of activities which could be classified as events, and they then tend to bring additional revenue which are required as and when some of these things which are held. Now,
Mm-hmm.
we had the Beyonce and Jay-Z concert in the Etihad Stadium in Manchester just I think a week and a half back. I was fully packed. It was manic and chaos on the roads. Obviously, everybody trying to reach that venue. And to look at it, that when you look at Etihad Stadium, one of the richest football teams in the world, they need to have an event which is sold out, a packed crowd of about, I think, 40,000 people in the stadium.
Yeah.
And the idea was that when this event was planned, the football stadium had to be transformed into a stage or a place wherein this concert would take place. And here is where you get to understand the gravity of, because events can happen anywhere. But what I'm trying to say in these points is two things. One, when you look at why events are held, or why some of these business people look at holding events, one clear answer is they want to look at bringing in additional revenues, get the cash flow going, and that creates a spike in their business. The second part is when you look at some of these traditional venues which have to look at hosting these events, there's a large scale operation which happens in order to transform some of these places to hold these events. So what you will get to see is that even though you want to do an event, but sometimes it is not practically possible because the stadium is maybe an open environment, and for a rock concert you need a closed kind of an environment where the sound and the acoustics actually tend to work in the favor of the artist or the performer who's actually doing the event. So some of these things require changes, and when you look at venues and when you look at locations which undertake these events on a regular basis, they tend to invest in the infrastructure to have the the infrastructure then cater to diverse and variable needs over a point in time, because they see this as a steady revenue stream coming across the year, wherein some of these things can happen. So events can sometimes be, in terms of their scope, size, they can be absolutely complex. It's not a simple case of I'm going to a movie, or if there is a launch or a, sometimes red carpet, when the red carpet is rolled out and the premieres of movies happen, because the infrastructure is geared to, host the movies or premiere or, have those events, that's absolutely fine. But sometimes when you look at, specific venues being catered to a particular type of event, you will see that due to the nature and the size and, the scope of the event, sometimes some of the venues are transformed into, care of providing the infrastructure, also having the audience, and then looking at creating revenue. So some venues would look at doing this on a year-long basis, and they are classified as event venues itself. Sometimes when you get to see exhibitions happening in locations wherein you will see that the whole stand or the whole side of the infrastructure is just designed to hold exhibitions or meetings. When you see stadiums and when you see venues which can be used for multiple purposes, over a point in time, some of these venues have transformed to be able to hold these diverse events, and that is where the size, scope, and complexity actually comes into being. A simple example that I will also say is obviously when we look at the Olympic Stadium in London, in East, that was essentially built for the track and field events. Also, had the opening and the closing ceremony was the main hub of the activity during the Olympics. But once the Olympics were over, a lot of this infrastructure had then to be transformed into, let's put it this way, venues which could host other types of events. So the stadium, has been sold off to a football team, and over the years they've spent, in the last 3 or 4 years, they've spent in excess of £100 million to be able to refurbish and change the venue to suit the requirements of hosting football matches, the American Football League, which also comes in place in the UK from time to time. And that has then made it a staple, venue where these kind of events, large-scale sporting events can actually happen. So it requires a lot of planning, it requires a lot of management. Sometimes it's long-term vision, because the scope and the complexity and the size of events that you want to hold from time to time, kind of have a bit of an effect on the venue, and that then has to be adapted to look at, say for example, hosting the events. Now let's look at the economic significance. Not much here, but kind of, already covered. So you have short-term and long-term benefits. Sometimes when you look at the short-term benefits, you're basically looking at having direct impact. Sometimes it's a multiplier effect, and sometimes it is increased tourism before and after the event. So when you look at the Olympics, if I stay with that example, or the FIFA World Cup, there's going to be a lot of tourists, fans which are going to be visiting Russia, and that would tend to increased, business or revenue for those cities in which the matches are happening, because the tourists or the fans are going in to stay, they're going to stay at the hotels, they're going to eat, wine and dine, and obviously this will bring across, increased revenue to the local community and the local economy. The long-term benefits or the long-term economic impacts could be sometimes when you look at the whole process of how, the bidding for Olympics happens. It happens in advance, and the reason why it happens is because hosting an large-scale mega event like Olympics requires a development of a lot of infrastructure, and this then gives the opportunities for the governments and the cities and the regional players, private public sector, to kind of tend to redevelop a lot of infrastructure or redevelop the infrastructure within the city, and that tends to attract investment. So, for example, it might not just be all public spending, which is in terms of spending by the government, but in some cases you will see that this spending primarily is a combination of spending by the private and public sector. So it attracts investment, and when these events happen, they are not happening for a day, 2 days, they are happening across for a couple of weeks, and that tends to bring in a steady flow of tourism, and the profile of the city to a certain extent gets elevated. So you will see that there's a lot of interest when we look at, and again, an example within the UK and within Europe, when you see the Cultural City of the Year, a lot of cities bid for this particular title. The whole idea of bidding for this particular title is that the city then gets a steady flow of tourists and tourist-related activities, get some investment from the European Union, and that city infrastructure really transforms. So you see long-term economic benefits happening, not just for the local community, but also for visitors who come in, the development of infrastructure, and in some cases regeneration, which is to look at, sometimes you will see the policies are made in such a way that the government earmarks certain funds which help regenerate the city in terms of old developments being, weeded out and the new developments coming in. So this tends to kind of, refresh, both in terms of, rejuvenate and refresh in terms of, the infrastructure and also the local economy. So long-term benefits, anything which goes over 3 to 5 years, short-term benefits, anything which goes, to 12 to 18 months, depending on what kind of projects or, the event classification is. Now, sometimes we also look at events from a point of view of its cultural significance. Right? You will see a sudden spike, specifically when you have some of the events which are related to, the culture or traditions of a particular city. And that is where you get to see that maybe it's a one-day spike, one-day increase in sales. So in the UK, a good day, a lot of, sales tend to happen for barbecues, the coal, and, a lot of other related things. If you have the sun coming out, it's bright and sunny outside, a lot of people have a lot of booze, and they'll do a lot of barbecues, and that tends to provide a bit of a spike. So similarly, when you see cultural side of things, there are lots of other things which basically look at celebration of diversity, and these are calendar events which local councils, regional governments actually incorporate in order to bring out participation and also working within the society, and that is why the cultural significance of these events. And sometimes you will look at indirect cultural impacts, which could be basically events which are happening, but they bring together a lot of diverse communities, people from different facets of life, and also both nationally and internationally, and they tend to be then having an indirect event impact, because those events bring together communities, or say for example in this case, when Olympics were held in England, a lot of families got together because some of the families visit every year, but they say, oh, you want to visit this place specifically is because there's Olympics happening, so we'll not only visit you, but we'll also come in and see the Olympics, or see an event in the Olympics. So that could be the indirect impact. Now let's look at briefly understanding, what are the significance, from a point of view of having this as a activity within the THM sector. Now, events can be utilized both by the government and the private sector, and they have a range of their own objectives in terms of why they want to do it, how they want to do it. I think from the public sector government point of view, when we look at, I think it's safe to assume and say that some of these events have strategic objectives, which is to look at either promoting the culture of the city or the nation. It could be to do with bringing in investment. It could be to do with looking at reviving a particular tradition, or making the culture, reviving the culture of that city, and then kind of having to spread that across as a ripple effect over the years to kind of bring in some sort of investment, or some sort of a piggy riding objective, which is on the back of popularizing it from a governmental point of view. But when you look at the private sector, when they put in the money, when they pour the money in, they are very clear in terms of why they want putting the money in. Why do you think this destination is going to be popular? So they go into a lot of strategic reasons. So look at, for example, a place like Heathrow. Heathrow is by far one of the busiest airports in the world. I think it ranks within the top 10. When you look at that, a lot of exhibitions, events, conferences, meetings which tend to happen, there are lots of venues and locations around Heathrow which basically cater to this type of audience. Now, over the years, as the airport has expanded, what has happened is the investment into some of this infrastructure has also increased, because the private sector is interested in looking at investment strategically in order to get returns from this investment. So their aim is to look at build venues around the airport wherein they could fly delegates in, have 1 or 2 day meeting or conferences, and then they could fly back easily without having to touch other parts of the city or the country. So here, the private sector looks at things like immediate returns on investment, and their kind of investment into any such location or any such venue tends to be more or less related to driving commercial revenues. And these could be short-term revenues, or it could be long-term revenues. So short-term could be when we look at anything which is going to bring across a bit of spike. And those short-term investments could be from a private sector point of view, that okay, if there's a football match happening, it happens across the year as a calendar. It's a calendar event. They would then look at making some investment in and around that particular venue, and that could be, say, for example, building up a hotel, or an inn, which would allow people to come in and stay overnight, and obviously have proximity to the venue because events are happening. Now, on a long-term basis, when you look at Heathrow as an example, which I've given, it's not happened something which has happened overnight. Heathrow, as the popularity of the airport has grown as a linking, city or the airport, which basically links, I would say Europe to the Americas, and obviously a lot of flights stop either at, you look at Frankfurt, for example, Charles de Gaulle in, obviously Paris, and you look at, Schiphol in Amsterdam, you look at London Heathrow. These are 4 airports from which all long-haul or destination flights actually go. So what has happened is, over the years, the private sector has invested into these airports in order to create infrastructure which allows tourists or visitors to come in, take a day out, go into the city. But the infrastructure in and around the airport is obviously being created to stimulate, business or business-related activities, so that meetings could happen, conferences could happen, and they tend to return on investment from a long-term perspective. So private sector normally looks at commercial objectives. Government sector or government policies and legislation looks at multifaceted things. They look at, say, for example, regeneration, infrastructure development, public-private sector partnership. They look at, revival of a culture or a tradition. They also look at, bringing in investment which would kind of rejuvenate or, kind of regenerate the city, in terms of long perspective. And the idea there would be to strategically invest in venues which could become event venues, and over a point in time, these event venues then trying to drive the local economy in that particular location. So if you have a velodrome, say for example, when the Olympics are happening, what the government will do is not build all the infrastructure in one location. They would spread that across. So there were some venues in London, some in Manchester, some in Birmingham, some in other cities like Leeds. And the idea was to spread the investment in terms of infrastructure so that some of these events can happen in these locations, which would also see the benefits of money flowing in and helping the local economy. But once the Olympics were over, some of these infrastructures were then handed over to the local councils and the regional governments or the councillors, and they then tend to drive revenues into the local community or create opportunities for business employment for years to come. And that is where the government looks at strategic objectives. Is that okay? Now let's look at going into, so that was a bit of a background into, looking at learning outcome 1. And let's look at now a few slides specifically related to, task 1.1. So when we look at, task 1.1 talks about how do you look at, classifying events. Now, events can be classified into different types. There could be small events, large events, hallmark events, and could be mega events. These are 4 classifications. So when we look at, mega events, these are events, as the name itself says, they create a lot of revenue. They have a lot of participation. There's a lot of participation from a point of, not just the audience, but there's a lot of back-end coordination required to deliver this event. And that is why these are mega events. They require, for months, even in some cases, years. And in order to make them successful, because there's a lot of investment riding on these events, the main aim of the organizers is to ensure that it is able to bring a return on investment, which is the money which has been invested in these events. They happen, not very frequently. The frequency of these events, also makes them mega events, because if I have to have, say, for example, a FIFA Cup final every year, then you will tend to have decreasing audiences coming in. But if it happens once in 4 years, you will see that there's a lot of excitement and to be able to attend that event. And that is why, because they happen, the frequency of these events happening is low as compared to other small scale events which happen. You tend to see that these are classified as something called mega events. And examples are Olympic Games. You have the FIFA World Cup, which is happening in the US. We look at the NFL Super Bowl, and these are events which we class as mega events. Hallmark events are events which tend to happen in a particular location, and they happen in that location only. So here in this case, when I have to give you a simple example to understand, when we look at the Grand Prix races which happen across the year, we have 28 races across 28 cities, around the globe, and these events are events which tend to drive not just fans, people who are interested in the sport, the organizers, the industry in general. But because these events happen across the year and they happen every year, happen at the same location, that is why we term them as hallmark events. The difference between hallmark and mega events is the venues keep changing for mega events. But for hallmark events, you will generally see that the venue of the event normally remains the same. So if you have a festival, like when I say the Global Festival, which happens in the UK during the summers, that festival, the location keeps changing, but it's a hallmark event in the calendar of music events which happens in the UK. And that is why we tend to say that, okay, this is an event which is a hallmark event. Now, when we look at, depending on now specifically looking at the classification in terms of size. Now, when we look at major events, we are looking at a classification where we're talking about the size of the event in terms of coverage they get, the money that they are able to generate, how many people or audience or visitors that event will basically in, and what could be the economic benefits of that event. Now, there's something called the Mobile World Congress, MWC, or if you the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, which happens in the US, the Mobile World Congress, which happens in Barcelona. Now, these are major events which happen, and these are events which are created by the industry, wherein the whole telecommunication industry or the consumer electronics forum industry actually converges into that city for a few days, when the event is happening. Particular kind of an event which attracts a lot of visitors coming in, the business community, and garners a lot of media coverage. So that means you will see that this event is more or less a commercial event in nature, 100% commercial. It has got, and it happens in a specific venue. In some cases, the venues do change, but the venues tend to be kind of, venues chosen for 7 to 10 years. So if you look at the MWC, which has been happening in Barcelona for the last 8 years, it happens twice a year. They have created a specific infrastructure in Barcelona in a city which is called Fira now, and that city basically hosts this major event. So you have about 250,000 visitors visiting this major event across a span of 4 days. There are over 4,000 exhibitors, and you get that hustle bustle of that activity, which basically is all related to media, business community, the buzz, and obviously commercials, because the telecom sector is having the event. The similar event you see in Japan, which is called Wireless Japan. You see similar events which happen elsewhere in the world, and they tend to kind of focus on a particular sector, and they look at a burst of activity happening in the span of 2 or 3 days or 3 or 4 days. Now, minor events could be events which are happening across the year. They are also calendar events. But here, the participation obviously has decreased. So when you say we are hosting, say for example, sometimes you will say during the winters we host, say for example, the Santa's Grotto. For example, that's a small event which comes up as a location, and a lot of families visit and things like that. It could be a event which could be related to a specific festival which is happening, or an event which is happening. And that could be just for entertainment purposes, or it could be for social and cultural purposes, and that would be classed as a minor event. Now, for minor events, it could include anything which involves a gathering of a few thousand people, happens in a particular location, could have sponsors, could have commercial objectives, could have social objectives, could have entertainment objectives, and these tend to be sometimes minor events. Some of the gigs that we go to, which is basically looking at, listening to a lot of comedians, and, you go out for a night, but you have a few thousand people that, would be called a minor event. You have a celebrity coming in, it's really a minor event. But yes, those are the events which are classed as, basis the size of the event, and they would be classed as, minor events. Now let's briefly look at, we've discussed some of these, but just skipping through some of the slides, quickly going through. Now, the events can be categorized into various different categories. Sporting events, we understand. Music festivals, entertainment events, we understand. Art and cultural festivals, we understand. Family events. We have charity events, which are, charity dinners, which we typically use or go to or create primarily for fundraising. And then you have corporate events. Now, each of these different type of events have different types of issues, different types of requirements to create and present different kind of challenges. Now, some of these challenges, problems, and opportunities which these events create are also same, but the scale and the type of event changes some of the opportunities and the challenges it actually poses. So when you look at, just quickly differentiating, when you look at a sporting event versus a corporate event, what do you think security will be an issue? Or will be a consideration? A key consideration will be when you host a music festival or an entertainment festival wherein you have thousands of people attending, sporting event, and when you look at a fundraising event or a family event, security will be one of the things which will be a challenge, because you want the safety of the people attending the event. So that focus on because of the size of the event, it attracts, the visitors it attracts, becomes an event wherein you have challenge, which is a security challenge. But when you look at a corporate event, I think the challenge would be a different kind of a challenge, would be to ensure that you have, or if you look at a charity event, which is for fundraising, the challenge would be to look at how do we raise and achieve that target which has been set for, kind of fundraising. So you have to create activities which keep the members participating in that event engaged, which then tends to be the fund raising, or the raising the champagne, raising this and saying, okay, yes, I will contribute. So different challenges when we look at different types of events. Classification of events can also be done on the basis of whether they are local events, national events, or global events, right? And depending on that classification, you will see that sometimes challenges also change. So if you have an event like the FIFA World Cup, which is a global event, but happening in one particular country, and the matches are happening in one particular stadium in one particular city. So here you see a combination of local, national, and global challenges all clubbed into one. But sometimes you will see that because of the nature of the events, the type of challenge it poses, the opportunities or the business opportunities it provides, you will see that they tend to vary depending on what is the scale, where the event is happening, and how much participation it has from the industry and the audience in general. And that would be a classification you could also look at for by saying that, okay, it's a local event, it's a national event, or it's a global event. Now, one of the other things that we will look at primarily would look at understanding, this is one slide, but this is a full LO that we will do, and that will be LO3 in the third term, I mean the lecture. But what we want to be able to understand is understand this term MICE. Now, MICE has become an acronym, and this is very much synonymous with the events industry within the THM sector. So when we look at MICE, MICE stands for Meeting, Incentives, Conventions, and Exhibition. Now, meetings, you understand, conventions are large gatherings of people, which could be for a particular occasion. Or, for example, when we look at the Consumer Electronic Forum, I would classify that as a convention, where there are a lot of seminars being delivered, guest speakers attending, things like that. What are incentives? Now, you must have seen that in companies, a lot of people, the department puts together sometimes, in all companies, mostly HR department puts together a scheme. If you achieve the targets, you get incentives. So when you travel for the purpose of, business and pleasure, but it has been facilitated by achieving a certain particular target or, let's say, a goal or an objective which has been set, you will see that rewards sometimes within the organizations are classed as, one of the types of rewards being classed as are rewards which are talking about international travel, or it involves the ability to be able to travel because you've achieved a particular target, sales objective, or something that you've reached as a milestone. So incentives are a key part of the MICE as a sector, and you will see that there are certain destinations in the world which are predominantly classed as tourist destinations, wherein you will see a lot of companies book holiday packages for their employees or for their teams, because they are termed as or basically they have become synonymous with destinations wherein people come when they've achieved a target or, say, for example, a particular objective. So sometimes you look at locations wherein companies would say, okay, if the sales team achieves this target in this particular quarter, then apart from whatever you get as bonus or perks, you will also have an incentive which will have a 2-day, 2-night, 3-day holiday included for all the members in that team. So MICE is a big industry within events as a sub-industry sector or a sub-industry within the events segment. And this we will study in a bit more detail, because you need to understand this, and there are lots of career opportunities just working within the MICE sector. So people are involved in all sorts of things within this sector, and we will discuss this in Learning Outcome 3. Let's briefly look at some of the characteristics of different types of events. So what I've done is I put some footnotes here, but we'll briefly cover it through the slide. Here, what it is, there are different types of events which can be, the events could be classified in different types. And if you look at just corporate events, corporate events could be all of these types. They could be conferences, seminars, meetings, trainings, trade shows, golf events. Sometimes you have product launches, award ceremonies, award and presentation ceremonies. These are all just corporate events. And what we need to be able to do is, in this particular task, the idea is to understand the classification of the events. So you look at corporate events, and we look at all these types just coming under corporate events only. So similarly, when we look at other types of events, the idea would be to understand and classify the 4 types that we've covered under this particular task. And what I've done is, in the footnote, I put, there's a very nice website. If you click on one of these links, it'll take you to the website, and it explains all the events in 1 or 2 line definitions. And those is what the classification an event is. So we need to be able to understand from a point of view of the events industry. A few slides which are put together, which are primarily showing you the statistics of the UK tourism industry. How big is, and I'll make this full screen, how big is the events industry in the UK? You look at, there are over 10,000 venues just in UK alone. London is the #1 city in terms of an event city, meetings and event city in the European region. So in the European, Middle East and Africa region, if you see. There are 85 billion people who come in and attend meetings and conferences every year across the UK, but primarily, I would say London. And this industry I mentioned to you earlier contributes, when I said travel and tourism, it was just the events industry contributes about 42 billion, pounds in revenue. There are, an average, if you look at 570,000 events which happen, jobs which are there, and when you look at the events which happen, multiply 10,000 by, divide that by, 42.3 billion, you will see an average attendee almost, when it says it's not, don't look at it literally, but almost every attendee kind of contributes about 65,000 pounds in terms of revenue, or, all the fees put together, whether it's stay, food, clothing, taxi, parking, flights, that is the kind of, revenue which each individual visitor actually generates, when they are attending an event. And this industry is growing, year on year. There is, growth happening in this sector. That is why it's classed as one of the key revenue drivers within the THM sector. Lots of different types of events, as we have covered. Outdoor events, could be music concerts, the World Cup which is happening. Lots of charity events which happen throughout the year. You will see the classification of MICE going across, exhibitions, meetings, conferences, and that is where also it drives revenue. Music festivals and concerts are a big part, because if you see it within this sector generates about 2.3 billion pounds just from participation and ticketing fees alone. Now, going to the last learning outcome for this particular first learning outcome, last of the first learning outcome. What we are looking at is, let's understand clearly what is the relationship between three terms that we will come across throughout this course. How do we define tourism? What is hospitality? And how is event management related to this sector? And we need to understand this classification in terms of the relationship by understanding the definition of the three different terms. So let's look at, sometimes when you say tourism, we will study about this and we will say tourism is for culture, tourism could be for religion, tourism could be for sports, it could be for education, loads of different classification of tourism also we will study in some of the other units. But when we look at defining tourism, what we want to be able to do is, how do we understand the context of tourism, and how do we understand context of hospitality, and why are they related with events management? That is what we want to understand in task 1.3. So when we look at anything which is happening as an activity for leisure, pleasure, but not professional, it is only for personal reasons, that is what you classify as a tourism activity. So imagine if you're going on a holiday, and you go on a holiday, to a particular destination, and that sometimes when you do these feedback questionnaires at the hotel, when you're checking out or checking in and stuff like that, you always have that question: are you visiting for business or pleasure, or both? Correct?
Yes.
You've seen that. Now the reason why they want to do is they want to get this classification very clearly, that in order to know what this destination is for, why are you staying at the hotel. Because one thing which is quite clear in this industry is, because this is a service level industry, what the industry tends to do is, people working in this particular sector tend to kind of understand, and they want to understand in as much detail as possible your preferences. They want to understand your likes and your dislikes. The reason why this is done is because if they know exactly what you want, then the services could be tailored to provide, to bring those things that you want, and that then helps a good experience. And a good experience within the sector brings you back to that location, that destination, that hotel again and again, which is vital for this industry because it helps drive repeat revenue or repeat business. So when we talk about tourism broadly in the terms of looking at, you traveling for reasons of pleasure, vacation, holiday, that would be classed as tourism. Now, let's look at hospitality. Now, hospitality is an offset of when you go to a hotel, you expect, when you're paying a certain amount, you're expecting the services to be of certain quality or certain level. So hospitality is something which is delivered to you when you are at that location, at that venue, or when you're utilizing the services in that location or that venue. So if you check into a hotel, you expect the hotel room to be having this, maybe having some facilities, some infrastructure, and if you find that to be there, you generally feel that okay, you've been taken care of, and you're more happy because you received the things which were in your expectation set. So things which you receive and creates memorable experiences would be nothing but hospitality. So hospitality in general would be the service that you receive when you go to a location or a venue. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, if I have to just broadly, relate this now to, if you look at the concept, tourism is an activity, hospitality is a service that you get, and when we look at events, what we tend to do is that they tend to kind of, events in general tends to be a mix, which happens when both these other variables are present. So if you are going to if you are going on a holiday and you are going to be participating in a certain activity which is going to give you service in general. Say, for example, you're taking a vacation and you have kids and you go to, say, a hotel which has some water rides and other things like that. You expect the water to be, warm. You expect the facilities to be clean. And because you're receiving that, that tends to be hospitality. Now, what is the event in that case? Because the reason why you've chosen that as a destination or that as a hotel within that destination is because you wanted your kids to have water rides, or for example, you wanted your kids to have a particular, access to a particular show or whatever it is, and that tends to be an event. So tourism is a venue or is a kind of an activity that you take. Hospitality is nothing but the service that you receive when you reach that venue. An event is the in general, I would say the service related to the activity that you receive when you choose a particular destination or a location for holiday. So they tend to work in tandem and to kind of depend on each other, because without tourism, you cannot have hospitality. Without hospitality, you cannot have tourism. So because you're going to relax, because you're going for business, because you're going for pleasure, you want to be able to receive some services for which you're paying in order to receive those services. Those then tend to create that interaction and this relationship between three terms. And sometimes when you're at that location, at that venue, what you tend to do is you participate or you want to be participating in certain activities, and those activities then tend to be classed as something called events. Is that okay? So sometimes you will also see that if you have a location, you have a venue, for example, I'm going to give you another example. So if you go to a particular destination for holiday like Majorca, what you tend to do is you choose that location because it has lots of activities to do. And there could be, beach activities, it could be scuba diving, whatever to do with those activities. The reason why you've chosen that location is because you want to go there and relax, but you also want to be able to participate and try out something which then creates the events in those locations. And that is why those events, those locations are sold to you, because you have lots of things to be able to do if you're going there for 3 days, 4 days, 7 days, or, a few weeks. So when you look at the whole package, tourist operators, tour operators in general, when you look at Thomas, for example, Thomson, when you look at some of the large operators which are Jet to Holidays, and some of these operators which tend to work across Europe, so what you will see is that they look at the combination of these three things. What could be a destination should be classified as a tourist destination? what could be a destination which is known for its hospitality, food, and the events which happen in that location, and that can be driving lots of revenue, for these tour operators, and that is where there's a significant relationship between the three. So without understanding a location, you cannot bring in the serviceability, and without understanding serviceability and how to increase revenues, you cannot bring in, you need to bring in events. And when you have the combination of three, then it tends to work well, because it then tends to generate revenue, tends to be an attraction for tourists, tends to be an attraction for businesses. And that is the main reason why, you will see that these three terms, kind of coexist, and without one, without the other, it is not possible to have some of these things happening in that location. Okay. Any questions on today's session, Selena?
Points.
Sorry, come again, Selena. Just the voice is not that clear. Let me call you on WhatsApp.
Okay. Just to go through all the slides. Great. Thank you very much.